All right, the next thing in the part of the footstool that we're going to go over is a final sanding. And when you first originally, prior to gluing this, we gave you some 80 grit sandpaper. And the purpose of the 80 grit sandpaper was to actually take and get the planer lines out of the board. The planer lines are those things that we said either look like Ruffles potato chips or the rumble strips on the side of 79. And what it does is it gets that off of there. If you start with too fine of a grit, what's going to happen is all you're going to do is polish those bumps. You're not going to get rid of them. So the first grit that you want to start with, and the way you determine your grit, is by looking at the back of the piece of sandpaper. So if you look at this one here, it says P80. So this is an 80 grit piece of sandpaper. That gets rid of your planer lines and pencil lines. If you look at this one here, this is 150. That gets rid of the scratches that the 80 grit puts in. And then the final grit you'll use right before you're ready to put a finish on is 220 grit sandpaper. Now, all too often I see kids take this entire sheet of sandpaper and they just start sanding with it like this. Well, that's not how you actually, all it is really wasteful. So what you want to do, you want to take your 3 different grits of sandpaper, you want to fold your piece of paper in half, like so. You want to take a roller, and all you're going to do is put it in there, and you got 2 pieces. Now, you want to do it again. All you need is a quarter sheet. So you're going to take your next piece, you're going to fold it in half, and you're going to do that for each one of your grits. So you're going to do it with your 80 grit, you'll probably need 1 sheet. You're going to do it with your 150 grit, you'll fold it in half. You'll get 2 out of that. Now these are the same. The reason we do this, when you start using power sanders, the power sanders are called quarter sheet power sanders. And when you start to use them, that's what they hold, is a quarter sheet. So if you can't use the remainder of what you have, then somebody else in another class can also put it on a power sander and you're not wasting it. So you got your 80s cut in there, you got your 150 cut into pieces. Now this should be able to use for enough. Each one of these pieces should do 4 people. So if you grab a sheet of each, 80, 150, and 220, you're going to be able to share. You're going to be able to share that with 3 other people, including yourself. So you'll have 4 people that are able to use 1 sheet of sandpaper. So we'll go like this. We'll get our 220, and we'll just do it one time to save time here. You guys get the concept. We're getting a quarter sheet of paper out of that. And so let's explain the difference between the 3 of these. So if you look at the 3 of these, they don't look a whole lot different. That one in the middle, that's your 80 grit. The one on the right side, that's your 150, and the one on the left is 220. So what's the difference? Well, here's how sandpaper works. The higher the number, so if you look on the back, the higher the number, which this is 220, the smoother the surface. So what happens is 220 means that there are 220 pieces of sand for every square inch on this piece of sandpaper. Where on an 80 grit piece of sandpaper, there's roughly 80 grits of pieces of sand for every square inch. So why does that matter? Well, think about it as lying on a bed of nails. So every once in a while you'll see a magician and they'll say, watch me lie on these nails. Well, if you lie on one nail, it's going to poke through you, means it's more abrasive. Now, if you lie on 1,000 nails or 220 nails, like this 220 grit piece of sandpaper, it's going to more evenly distribute that weight across that object. So a person can lie on a bed of nails without it penetrating. It's less abrasive, okay? So when you go to sand, the things that you want to concentrate on, I always start out with 80. 80 gets rid of any pencil mark. It gets rid of any imperfections. So if we zoom down to our stool here, I'm going to take me out of the equation and I'm going to put the stool on the equation. If you look at the footstool, from laying out my dowel pins, I still have pencil lines from the layout. I still have areas on the top of that stool from where I put the dowel pins in. I want to look around at any area. Most of my things should have already been sanded, but if I have any glue marks that I didn't clean up after gluing, I want to take care of those. I want to look around and see if there's any areas that I can hit with the 80 grit. So what I do is I take this here, I put it on the table, I grab a block of wood, I wrap my sandpaper around it, and then you want to simply go like this and get rid of any marks that are left on that board. If you try to skip over a grit and go and think you can just go right to 220, all you're going to do is polish the imperfections. You're not going to get rid of the pencil lines. You're not going to get rid of the planer lines. And all you're going to do is polish those imperfections. So then when you put a finish on, all it's going to do is magnify the imperfections, because that's what finish does. It takes the beauty of the wood and it brings the beauty of the wood out. Well, it'll also bring the beauty of the imperfections out if you leave them in there. So I'm not going to do this whole stool for you. You'll get the gist. You'll start with the top. You'll do the legs. You'll do the sides of the legs. All areas that need touched with the 80 grit. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to switch over to the 220 or the 150 grit. So you'll grab your 150, grab your block of wood, wrap your paper around it. Now the 220 grit or the 150 grit, the sole purpose of that is to get rid of the main scratches that the 80 grit put in. And you can actually hear the difference between the two grits as I'm sanding. It's not quite as coarse. It's not as loud of a noise if you listen from the 80 grit to the 150 grit. The more time you take sanding, and you have to pay attention, you just can't sit there and sand over the edges and all around, because all you'll do is round over all your corners. So you want to make sure you take your time. That's why the block of wood is on there. So this gets rid of the scratches that the 80 put in. And then the final thing that you want to do is get your 220 grit. Now the purpose of the 220 grit is only right before you get ready to put a finish on. You don't want to sand with 220 grit and then store this in a locker for a couple of weeks, because what will happen is, because there's moisture in the air, what will happen is wood always expands and contracts, and when it expands, it acts like a sponge and it actually raises the grain back out. So the 220 grit is right before you get ready to put a finish on. I'm going to do it now just to kind of show you what you're going to do. Just wrap it around your block of wood. You want to make sure you hit all your areas. And you can hear the difference from the 80 grit. Let's go back to 80, and just so you can hear it. How rough the 80 is as opposed to the 150. And then back to the 220. So there's a big difference because you're not taking as much material off. So this will make it as smooth as you ever need a project to be. There's actually such a thing as making it too smooth. If you make your project too smooth, your finish won't want to stick on there very well. So if you get it down to like a 500 grit, which you would do over in Metal Shop, or 600 grit, that would become too smooth, and when you go to put a finish on, it actually won't stick very well. So 220 grit is perfect for anything that we need to do over here. When you're doing stuff on the lathe and you want to bring it to a high polish, then you can go to a higher grit. That's fine if you're just going to use like an oil to stain it. So you want to do that on all parts of each piece. So that was the top. You want to do it on all the legs, 80, 150, 220. You want to get anywhere that you can see. If you take your time and do that, your product is going to look much better. I don't care what you're making. I don't care if you're making a bed. I don't care if you're making a dresser. The better you sand, the more attention you put into detail, the better off your project is going to look at the end. So you just pay attention. You want to make sure you're paying attention to the way you're sanding. To do your corners, I want to go over that real quick. You want to make sure you start with your 80. You don't need your block of wood. This is that rounded edge that we want to take care of. Now you want to pay attention when you're sanding. You just don't want to sand and look around the room. You want to pay attention to what you're trying to sand and what you're trying to accomplish, because 80 grit sandpaper will actually shape your project too if you're not careful. So if you have an area that needs a little bit of attention to it, maybe the routed edge didn't look good in an area, you can actually make that routed edge look as good as you want because you can reform it. So you'll take your 80, you'll get it where you need it. Now remember, I didn't go over this. When you're sanding, if you paid attention, I'm sanding with the grain. You don't ever want to sand against the grain. If you start sanding against the grain, all it does is tear out your wood and scratch it. The only place that you can sand against your grain is on your very end grain. So you can take your 80 grit on your end grain, because end grain is very hard. So when you sand it, it doesn't matter if you go left and right. It's actually one of the hardest places to sand. And then you're going to grab your 150 and then your 220. Your end grain can actually become your smoothest part because of how hard that end of the board is. And then you'll bring it down to a 220. But that'll be your smoothest part when you do your ends, and it doesn't matter. You don't really get scratches in it. So you want to do that on all areas, all sides. To do it correctly, to sand a footstool correctly and that it's perfect, it takes about a day, a whole period to do it. 40 minutes or so, maybe even 2 days, depending if you have a lot of glue marks. And that's what you want to pay attention to. So if you look down in here, if you see, like I have a wee little glue mark. If you can see, I don't know if you can see, it's a little bit yellow. If you see any glue, you have to get rid of that, because when you go to put a stain on this, that's going to stand out like a sore thumb. The darker the stain, the better you see it. So if you go with like a dark walnut or something like that, it's going to look like dark walnut on a piece of wood, and then you end up with what we showed you before, is the glue and stain do not mix. So you want to pay attention. You want to put the glue on. When you go to glue your project, you want to take your time so that now all you're doing is sanding off the lines, and you're not trying to sand away glue. Glue's hard to sand away, and it can take you a long time. So that's the basic runaround. The final step to this, I'm not going to hit this with 220 grit now because I'm not going to put a stain on this today. But the final step after I get it all sanded will be to put a stain on it, and then to put a polyurethane coat on the day after that, and possibly probably two polyurethane coats. So that gives you the general runaround on how to sand. Make sure you share your sandpaper with people, and that's it.